And the Oscar goes to...
And the Oscar goes to...
And the Oscar goes to...
I don't care!
What's next?
What's next?
What's next?
Don't you want to hear what's next?
What are you going to do next?
What's next for you?
What's next?
What's next?
Okay, so what's next?
I'm Connor Old, and welcome back to another episode of After the Gold. And this week we're going to be looking at a cosmically important movie in the history of cinema, considered to be many as one of the best movies of all time, with a fascinating production history that we're going to dive into on this episode. I'm talking about 1979's Apocalypse Now. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is talk about Best Picture follow-up movies. Movies that a director made right after winning Best Picture, how they get the movie made, what was the production level, what was it kind of the production history, and then what was the result of that movie itself. So the first part, kind of the historical production context of the movie, and then the second half of the video, giving my thoughts on what I think the movie is, how good it is, how bad it is. We're doing no sort of order. We'll jump from the 2010s to the 70s to the 60s and kind of all over the place, with the common theme ultimately, though, being interesting Best Picture follow-ups. That doesn't necessarily mean it has to be successful. We covered, like, let's say, Widows last week, which is a movie I really liked that didn't get a lot of Oscar attention. But sometimes you want to talk about Lawrence of Arabia, which wins Best Picture after having won Best Picture in the case of David Lean. And I see a lot of parallels, actually, between the Apocalypse Now and Lawrence of Arabia. Both movies that I think represented an end of an era for a filmmaker. I think Lawrence of Arabia for David Lean was his last great movie. Some may say that for the same thing for Apocalypse Now with Francis Ford Coppola, when you have this incredible run in the 70s of The Godfather, The Conversation, The Godfather Part 2, and then Apocalypse Now, all considered some of the best movies of all time. And then his career didn't necessarily reach the same heights for a lot of people in the second half. And both movies also had really strenuous productions. If you don't know, Apocalypse Now has one of the most complicated productions in history. They even made a documentary about it called Hearts of Darkness, which is an excellent documentary if you want to kind of explore a little bit more about that. But before we get to that part, I think we have to kind of go backwards and talk about The Godfather Part 2. So that's the film that Apocalypse Now is following up. So it really is kind of like any other Best Picture follow-up, but maybe even to a greater extent, a huge anticipation of someone's next movie. Because not only did Coppola win Best Director and Best Picture for 74 in The Godfather Part 2, but the first Godfather movie also won Best Picture and was a huge hit. So it was an insane situation whereby you have a Best Picture follow-up. Technically, you had The Conversation in between the two Godfathers, but you have a Best Picture follow-up that essentially is coming off of two Best Picture wins. Like I said, you technically do have The Conversations, but it was 72 Best Picture, 74 Best Picture. Now what's next? And what was so interesting about the history of this movie too is that we talk about how filmmakers, once they win Best Picture, oftentimes kind of get a blank check. They sign with whatever studio they want, they get creative control, they get usually an increase in budget, and they're allowed to do what they want because their past film just won Best Picture. Studio executives aren't going to get fired by, hiring the director that just won Best Picture, because clearly they know something that we don't. So oftentimes we see with the Best Picture follow-ups the kind of blank checks, the kind of passion projects that filmmakers have always been wanting to make. And Coppola could have done that. He could have gone with a studio like he did with the Godfather movies, but instead, he wanted to essentially personally finance this movie through his company. Instead of taking a big paycheck from one of the studios in creative control, he wanted complete creative control. So American Zoetrope, which did exist in the past and did kind of co-produce some of the earlier Coppola movies, now really want to be a major studio player outside of the studio system. And Apocalypse Now was to be the first movie. And what's so fascinating, you hear the documentary and you do some readings, is that they chose Apocalypse Now not because it was necessarily a passion project, but because it was the only one with a script ready to go that they really liked. And they figured, okay, let's shoot it on 16 millimeter and let's go to the, jungles in Vietnam or the Philippines and shoot for a couple of weeks and have this really kind of low budget type of approach. And then soon, because it was kind of the follow-up after Best Picture winner, the movie that's supposed to kind of launch this new studio, it balloons in budget and ambition, and now it's going to be this great war movie. And I don't want to go too in depth of all the kind of craziness of the history of this movie, but essentially they decide it's going to be the next movie. Coppola invests $2 million of his own money. It's his own company that's financing a lot of this. Of course, he does some distribution deals in advance to secure some of that money, but essentially what's fascinating about it is that he doesn't choose the easy option. He kind of gambles things again like he did for, let's say, The Godfather. He does that, but this time everything that can go wrong does go wrong. They recast the lead from Harvey Keitel to Martin Sheen. After they recast the lead in Martin Sheen, a couple weeks later, he almost dies of a heart attack. Their key supporting actor, Marlon Brando, doesn't know his lines, shows up, out of shape. Francis Coppola is rewriting the scenes, staying up all night and rewriting scenes to give to the actors the next day. Many of the actors, by their own admission, were on every drug imaginable, of speed to acid to weed to booze. It really was a crazy production in that sense, even in the sense of they were in the Philippines and they were using the Filipino Army's helicopters. And because they were fighting a war at the time with some communist insurgents, the helicopters would, in the middle of them filming something, would just go the other way and start fighting a war that was like 5 or 10 miles away from where the actual filming of the movie was. And you could say all of that kind of adds into the mysteriousness nature of the movie. But definitely at the time, I think you can't imagine that this movie is the example of a Best Picture follow-up that completely tanks. We hear in some of the diaries from the Hearts of Darkness documentary that Coppola was saying, this is going to be a complete failure. This isn't going to be just a boring movie. It's going to be a disaster, because he's swinging for the fences. And if he doesn't hit it, he wasn't going to get the movie he wants to. But then the movie eventually comes out. I think they started shooting in 76 or developing the project in 76. Comes out in May of 79 at the Cannes Film Festival, is where it premiered to rapture success, wins the Palme d'Or, and all of a sudden, it's a huge success. It does well at the box office, makes back all the crazy overages and budget that happened during the time. It gets nominated for 8 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director. It wins 2 for sound and cinematography. And by all means, at the end of the day, it was kind of a success. And yet, so many people, I think, look at this movie, or maybe Heaven's Gate, as the kind of end of the Hollywood studio, New Hollywood system of taking kind of big budgets and making bold, interesting movies. And even you would say that this maybe potentially broke Coppola, his next movies being a lot smaller in scale, but also maybe not being as well celebrated as the heights of The Godfather or, The Conversation, or even this movie here, Apocalypse Now. So it was a success, but kind of maybe at what cost? It's a fascinating kind of production history if you do want to read into that. But even doing a little bit more research, I guess I was so surprised at the fact that he does his own thing, Coppola, instead of going with a studio system, risking his own money, risking everything again. That's the way he kind of likes to operate, and he is a fascinating filmmaker and kind of entrepreneur in that sense. But now, just transitioning into my thoughts on the film. This can be a little bit more brief, just because what can you say about Apocalypse Now that hasn't already been said? But what I think really struck me on this rewatch was a couple things. The first one is just how weird it is for a classic movie. I kind of grouped this movie alongside 2001: A Space Odyssey or Mulholland Drive, where they're put, and when people present the classic great movies of cinema, they put Apocalypse Now right beside The Godfather or Citizen Kane. But when you have a movie like Citizen Kane, it has a relatively simple structure and story format. It's a rise and fall. It's kind of this biography of this fake-ish person. It's got, familiar kind of flashback sequences and structure. It's easy, I think, and accessible for someone, a new reviewer like myself, to watch the movie for the first time. But Apocalypse Now is kind of like 2001, where people don't necessarily preempt you enough to say how weird this movie is. The movie doesn't really have scenes. It is this kind of acid trip down a river. It is a Vietnam War movie, but it's also so much more trippy and odd than it actually is. I don't know if they have scenes so much as there are sequences and kind of set pieces. And our main character doesn't really have any sort of action, doesn't move the plot forward in any way. He is a kind of audience surrogate, very passive character, floating down the river, seeing these different aspects of the kind of Vietnam War that Coppola wants to comment on. And one thing that was always lost on me, and this may be a dumb thing, so bear with me, but I didn't realize that the book that it was based on was not a Vietnam War book. The movie was always pitched to me as Apocalypse Now, based on Heart of Darkness. So I thought, okay, that was a celebratory, Vietnam War book at the time. But it's not. It is a retelling of this story through the Vietnam War. And what that kind of reveals to you once you learn that aspect is that the sequences of the movie, the kind of plot structure is the same, going down the river, descent into madness, but the kind of interesting parts that Coppola puts in, whether it be the French plantation scene, whether that be the Playboy bunnies, all of it is kind of more of a comment, a social comment on the Vietnam War and how it felt to be there. I think when I think of great Vietnam War movies, whether it be Platoon or Born on the 4th of July or Casualties of War, you think of like a great Vietnam War movie, I think of like Born on the 4th of July, because it captures the war itself, but then also all the political implications and how they are treated after the war and kind of the public sentiment on things. But The Apocalypse Now is a great Vietnam War movie because I think it's maybe the best at capturing what it felt like to be there, of the kind of bombastic nature of the Ride of the Valkyrie scenes and bringing the helicopters over and all this equipment and the kind of big loud show and the dance and the Playboy bunny sequence being kind of another representation of that kind of American showmanship. But ultimately that being kind of a failure in a foreign land when you don't know who you're fighting, and there's this kind of haziness where you're just shooting at nothing. And, a lot of the Vietnam War soldiers as well were on drugs too at the time. So it was kind of a confusing, odd, why are we here situation. I think that's kind of history's modern day reputation of the Vietnam War. And I think Apocalypse Now best kind of tries to capture some of that feeling that maybe the soldiers were feeling at the time, so that you kind of understand the kind of odd, hazy, unsure nature of this foreign land. It's incredibly hot. You don't know where you are. You may be on drugs. You may be disoriented. And Apocalypse Now is able to actually recreate that feeling, which I think it's so successful at, while also kind of commenting, Coppola does, on the certain oddities of the French also being there in the past, and then the showmanship, and then also the kind of ridiculousness and the fruitlessness of the pursuit. Mixing that with kind of the human psyche falling apart in this Heart of Darkness kind of plot structure. It's a perfect kind of collaboration and marriage of materials, so much so that I didn't even realize it wasn't a Vietnam War book. Heart of Darkness was. So I think that's what sticks with me at the end of the day. It's not necessarily a piece of dialogue, or some of it's a bit of performances and how they're all kind of strange and different, but ultimately I think is the visuals, the meshing of scenes together. Of course, you have the kind of iconic overlays of superimposing one image over the other, so it kind of happens all at once. Interesting kind of montage, music type sequences, dreamlike sequences. It is kind of got this liquid narrative that I think is so interesting, with still the kind of structure of a general plot, so it's not completely lost on us. We still know we have to get down to the river to get to Colonel Kurtz, but everything that happens in between is so kind of psychedelic and interesting and bombastic. And then of course just the natural value of they were in the jungle and they were blowing stuff up and they used real helicopters and they had hundreds of extras and all the stuff that we don't necessarily get to see in modern day movies is always such a treat to see as well. But you could also see just how difficult the production was. At the end of the day, I do think it was worth it to get a master filmmaker to make this trippy, psychedelic, really mysterious film that rewards rewatches. I do think it's an excellent movie just because of how weird it is. It is sometimes difficult to grab onto, but it's also the type of movie that you want to continue to go back to try to figure it out. And every time you try to figure it out, you get kind of lost into one aspect of the movie. I think it's kind of a perfect marriage in that sense. Crazy to see how it came out of this ridiculous kind of production, but an excellent movie and one to be deserving to be made after the gold. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Have you seen Apocalypse Now? Have you seen the companion documentary, Hearts of Darkness? And what are your thoughts maybe on Coppola's movies after this point? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe I'm wrong. I personally like a Tucker, Man in His Dream, and some of the S.E. Hinton stuff, but probably agree that it's not at the same heights as The Godfathers and Apocalypse Now, because what could be. So a really fascinating movie that I felt like I had to cover, but then also discovered a lot of interesting production history that I thought worked well within the context of this series. But that's about it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and until next time, stay tuned.